Today, we examine every black woman currently awaiting execution in the U.S. Women whose crimes were so serious, the courts determined they should pay with their lives. But before we start, let us know in the comments whether your state has the death penalty or not. Heather Lavelle Keaton. In 2010, police in Mobile, Alabama launched an investigation into the disappearance of 3-year-old Chase DeBlas and 4-year-old Natalie DeBlas, and what they uncovered was horrifying. The children's stepmother, 26-year-old Heather Lavelle Keaton, had been abusing, starving, and poisoning them for months. Investigators found that she forced them to eat toxic substances like antifreeze, beat them, and withheld food until their small bodies could no longer endure the suffering. After they died, their father, John DeBlas, helped Heather dispose of their bodies in wooded areas across 2 counties. It took months for authorities to find them, and when they finally did, autopsies confirmed that the children had suffered severe malnutrition, beatings, and poisoning before their deaths. In 2015, Heather was convicted of capital murder. The jury voted for life in prison, but the judge overruled their decision, pointing to the brutality of the crimes. She was sentenced to death. Now 36 years old, Heather has spent 9 years on Alabama's death row. She continues to appeal her sentence, and no execution date has been set. Tiffany Nicole Moss. In November 2013, police in Gwinnett County, Georgia, responded to a call about a missing child. Inside the home, they made a horrific discovery: the burned remains of 10-year-old Imani Moss. Imani had suffered years of abuse at the hands of her stepmother, Tiffany Moss. In 2010, Tiffany had been charged with child cruelty after a teacher reported severe bruises and welts on Imani's body. She pleaded guilty and received probation. But after that, the abuse only escalated. By 2013, Tiffany had completely cut Imani off from the outside world. The girl was locked in a room, denied food, and left to waste away while Tiffany continued to care for her own biological children. Neighbors had no idea an older child even lived there. After weeks of starvation, Imani collapsed, too weak to move or eat. She lay in her own waste, weighing just 32 pounds, the size of a toddler. Tiffany and Imani's father, Emmon Moss, did nothing. And when Imani died on October 28, 2013, Tiffany saw her only concern: hiding the body. For days, they kept her corpse inside their apartment while Emmon returned to work, as if nothing had happened. Instead of reporting her death, Tiffany and Imani's father tried to cover it up. They stuffed her body in a trash can and set it on fire, hoping to destroy the evidence. But the fire didn't completely burn the body, so they brought the trash can back home. Finally, Emmon had a change of heart and called 911, claiming his daughter drank chemicals and died. But the police immediately saw through the lie, and Tiffany was arrested. At her 2019 trial, Tiffany chose to represent herself, refusing to speak, present a defense, or call any witnesses. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before sentencing her to death. Now 41 years old, Tiffany has spent 5 years on Georgia's death row. She is currently the only woman awaiting execution in the state. No execution date has been scheduled. Linda Carty. On May 16, 2001, in Houston, Texas, 42-year-old Linda Carty came up with a deadly plan. She wanted a baby, and she was willing to kill for it. Her target was 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez, a young mother with a newborn son. Desperately, Linda recruited 3 men to help her break into Joanna's apartment, tie her up, and throw her into the trunk of a car. By the next day, Joanna was dead, suffocated with a plastic bag. But Linda's plan had failed. The baby was found alive, and police quickly traced the crime back to Linda. Witnesses testified that Linda had told people she was pregnant, even though it was physically impossible. The jury didn't believe her defense, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. In 2002, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Linda has always claimed she's innocent, but her appeals have been denied. Now 65 years old, she has spent 22 years on Texas's death row. No execution date has been set. Antoinette Frank. Some crimes shock entire communities, and Antoinette's case was one of them. In 1995, Antoinette, a police officer at the time and an accomplice, walked into Kim An Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans and executed 3 people in cold blood. She shot and killed Officer Ronald Williams, who was working security that night, along with 17-year-old Quang Vu and 24-year-old Ha Vu, 2 members of the restaurant's family. Antoinette knew the victims. She had eaten at the restaurant, befriended the Vu family, and worked alongside Officer Williams. But none of that stopped her from pulling the trigger. And that was not it, as investigators later uncovered that this wasn't her first crime. She had robbed the restaurant before, but this time the motive was money. The betrayal ran deep as a police officer, sworn to protect, had turned into a killer. At her 1995 trial, the jury had no doubts she was sentenced to death. Now, 53 years old, Antoinette has been on Louisiana's death row for nearly 3 decades. Her appeals continue, and no execution date has been set. Tina Brown. On March 24, 2010, in Escambia County, Florida, 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman was ambushed in a savage attack that seemed straight out of a horror movie. That day, Tina Brown, along with her 16-year-old daughter, Brittany Miller, and neighbor Heather Lee, brutally attacked 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman in Pensacola, Florida, whom they had once been close to. They used a stun gun on Audriana, beat her with a crowbar, gagged her, and placed her in the trunk of a car. The group then drove to a wooded area, doused Audriana with gasoline, set her on fire, and left her to die in the flames. But despite her severe injuries, Audriana managed to reach a nearby residence and identify her attackers before succumbing to her injuries 16 days later. Investigators found clear evidence linking Tina to the crime as they were fighting over a man. The attack was planned, and the level of cruelty shocked even experienced detectives. In 2012, Tina was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Now 54 years old, Tina has spent 12 years on Florida's death row. Her appeals continue and no execution date has been scheduled. Carlette Parker. On February 12, 1998, in Durham, North Carolina, Carlette Parker pretended to be a caregiver and friend to 86-year-old Alice Covington. But in reality, she saw Alice as nothing more than a way to get money. That day, Carlette forced Alice to withdraw $3,000 from her bank account, and just moments later, in Alice's own home, Carlette held her down in a bathtub and drowned her. Alice Covington's body was found in her car, which was parked in a wooded area in Morrisville. Investigators quickly connected Carlette to the crime, as witnesses saw her with Alice at the bank just hours before the murder, and her financial records showed she was struggling with debt. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Carlette had preyed on Alice's trust and took advantage of her vulnerability. The jury agreed. In 1999, they sentenced her to death. Now 63 years old, Carlette has spent 25 years on North Carolina's death row. Her appeals continue, and no execution date has been set. Erica Shepard. On June 30, 1993, in Houston, Texas, 43-year-old Marilyn Meyer was found murdered in her own home. The crime was brutal. Erica Shepard, just 19 years old, and an accomplice forced their way inside, planning to rob the house. But the break-in turned deadly. Marilyn was stabbed multiple times with a butcher knife, then slashed in the neck with a broken glass bottle. After the murder, Erica fled, but investigators quickly tracked her down. Her accomplice later testified that Erica was the one who pinned Marilyn down while he delivered the fatal blow. In 1995, a jury found Erica guilty of capital murder, and she was sentenced to death. Now 51 years old, Erica has spent 29 years on Texas's death row. Her appeals continue, and no execution date has been set. Celeste Carrington. In 1992, Celeste Carrington worked as a janitor in the San Francisco Bay Area, but instead of cleaning offices, she used her job as an opportunity to rob and kill. On January 26, 1992, she broke into an office in Redwood City and shot 43-year-old Victor Esparza, a maintenance worker, killing him on the spot. But that was not it, as 2 months later, on March 11th, she struck again, this time at a doctor's office in Palo Alto. She broke into the office and shot and killed 34-year-old Caroline Gleason, the office manager. Her crimes caught up with her when she tried to cash a stolen check from one of her victims. Ballistics testing later matched her gun to both murders, sealing her fate. In 1994, a jury found Celeste guilty of capital murder and sentenced her to death. Now 62 years old, she has spent 31 years on California's death row. Lorraine Allison Hunter. In 2009, Lorraine Hunter planned the murder of her husband, Albert Thomas, to cash in on over $1 million in life insurance. On November 4, 2009, Albert was found shot 4 times inside his truck in Fontana, California. At first, there were no obvious suspects, but suspicions grew quickly when Lorraine asked about his life insurance payout just days after his death. For 2 years, the case remained unsolved, until 2011, when Lorraine's own niece came forward with the truth. She revealed that Lorraine and her 16-year-old daughter, Brianna, were behind the murder. Investigators uncovered that Lorraine had secretly taken out life insurance policies on Albert, forging his signature to name herself as the sole beneficiary. But it gets worse. They learned this wasn't her first attempt. She had planned his murder 3 times before, but backed out because there were too many witnesses. Brianna later admitted she had helped forge the life insurance documents, but it was her mother who pulled the trigger. And Lorraine wasn't done plotting. While awaiting trial, she tried to hire a hitman to silence her niece. In 2017, Lorraine was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Brianna was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Now 70 years old, Lorraine remains on California's death row. No execution date has been set. Patricia Blackman. On May 29, 1999, a hysterical call came into 911 from a home in Dothan, Alabama. Patricia Blackman, a 29-year-old woman, reported that her toddler wasn't breathing. But when paramedics arrived, the scene told a very different story. Paramedics arrived to find a scene of horrific abuse, and sadly, 2-year-old adopted Dominique Bryant was already gone. They were too late. Her body showed a fractured skull, broken bones, bruises, and a shoe print on her chest. Investigators determined the injuries were not accidental. They charged Patricia with capital murder, though the exact motive was never clear. But the evidence was overwhelming. At her trial in 2002, the jury voted 10-2 for the death penalty, which the judge agreed with their decision. The severity of the injuries and the child's young age left little room for leniency. For over 22 years, Patricia has been on Alabama's death row, held at Julia Tutwiler Prison for women. Her execution date has not been scheduled, and appeals continue. That wraps up this video. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.